frontier AI models. What does it take to train and deploy them? How difficult is it to fast follow? And what are the prospects for China into the medium term to be able to catch up and maybe one day surpass the likes of Anthropic, Google, and OpenAI? To discuss, I have on the podcast that I've perhaps learned the most engineering from over the past 12 months. The Latent Space crew, Alessio, who runs a venture firm called Decibel, and Shawn, who runs a firm called Smol AI. They both are celebrating their 1-year anniversary, hosting the leading podcast for AI engineers, a new discipline of sorts that we'll be getting into over the course of this hour. Shawn and Alessio, welcome to China Talk. So let's start off by talking through the ingredients that are necessary to train a frontier model.
Yeah. At the very, very basic level, you need data and you need GPUs. You also need talented people to operate them.
Let's do the most basic. Let's go from like easy to complicated. So say all I want to do is take what's open source and maybe like tweak it a little bit for my particular firm or use case or language or what have you. What's involved in and sort of riding on the coattails of Llama and Co.
Yeah, I would say like the leading open source models are Llama and Mistral, and both of them are very popular bases for creating like a leading open source model. This would not make you a frontier model as it's typically defined, but it can make you lead in terms of the open source benchmarks, right? So typically what you would need is you need some understanding of how to fine tune those open source models. Those are readily available. Even the mixture of experts models are readily available. And then some kind of fine-tuned data set, whether it's synthetic data sets or data sets that you've collected from some proprietary source somewhere. And I think that's definitely the way that you start.
I would say, yeah, the biggest thing about frontier is like, what's the frontier you're trying to conquer? So OpenAI, DeepMind, these are all labs that are working towards kind of AGI, I would say, as the end goal is like one model that does everything really well and it's amazing at all these different things and kind of gets closer and closer to human intelligence. I would say the open source world so far has more been about the GPU pours, So if you don't have a lot of GPUs, but you still want to get business value from AI, what can you do to do that? That's a whole different set of problems than getting to AGI. A lot of times it's cheaper to solve those problems because you don't need a lot of GPUs. Sometimes you need maybe data that is like very unique to a specific domain, or you might need a different product wrapper around the AI model that the larger labs are not interested in building. So yeah, that's really how the market is bifurcating right now. So the open source world has been really great at helping companies taking some of these models that are not as capable as GPT-4, but in a very narrow domain with very specific and unique data to yourself, you can make them better. So yeah, I would say data is definitely at the core of it. Now that if you think about Llama and Mistral as like a GPU donation to the public, like these models have been trained by Meta and by Mistral. So now you don't have to spend the $20 million of GPU compute to do it. You can only spend $1,000 on Together or on Mosaic ML to do fine tuning. So all of a sudden the math really changes. But so the data is important. But if you want to build a model better than GPT-4, you need a lot of money. You need a lot of compute. You need a lot of data. You need a lot of smart people. You need a lot of everything. So that's a much harder task.
So one of the ways I've thought about conceptualizing the Chinese predicament, maybe not today, but in, perhaps 2026, 2027, is like a nation of GPU pours where, if the export controls end up playing out the way that the Biden administration hopes they do, then, you may channel an entire country and, multiple, enormous billion-dollar startups and firms into going down these development paths, which, are kind of, not necessarily the sexiest from a, creating God perspective, but may end up continuing to only lag a few months or years behind behind what's happening in the leading Western labs. So a few questions that sort of follow out over that. Do you guys have what are the sort of like mental models or frameworks that you use to think about what the gap between what's available in open source plus fine tuning as opposed to what the leading labs will come out? What is sort of like driving that gap and how you may expect that to play out over time?
Yeah, the sad thing is, as time passes, we know less and less about what the big labs are doing because they don't tell us at all. Like, we don't know the size of GPT-4 even today. We have some rumors and hints as to the architecture just because people talk. And, one of our podcast's early claim to fame was having George Hotz on, where he leaked the GPT-4 mixture of experts details. But it's very hard to compare, Gemini versus GPT-4 versus Claude, just because we don't know the architecture of any of those things. And it's all sort of closed door research now as these things become more and more valuable. That said, I do think that the large labs are all pursuing like step change differences in model architecture that are going to really make a difference. Whereas the GPU cores are typically pursuing more incremental changes based on techniques that are kind of known to work that would improve the sort of state of the art open source models, a moderate amount. To date, even though GPT-4 finished training in August 2022, there is still no open source model that even comes close to the original GPT-4, much less the November 6 GPT-4 Turbo that was released, that is even better than GPT-4. The closed models are well ahead of the open source models, and the gap is widening. We can talk about speculations about what the big model labs are doing. We can also talk about what some of the Chinese companies are doing as well, which are pretty interesting from my point of view. But those seem more incremental versus what the big labs are likely to do in terms of like the big leaps in AI progress that we're going to likely see this year.
Yeah, and I think the other big thing about open source is like retaining momentum. So a lot of open source work is kind of like things that you can get out quickly that get interest and get more people looped into contributing to them, versus a lot of the labs do work that is maybe less applicable in the short term that hopefully turns into a breakthrough later on. So you kind of have different incentives, and therefore it's going to be hard to get open source to build a better model than GPT-4, just because like there's so many things that go into it that you can only figure out if you take a long time just experimenting and trying out.
This idea of sort of architecture innovation in a world in which people don't publish their findings is a really interesting one. And I think sort of, one of the key questions is to what extent that knowledge will end up staying secret, both at a sort of Western firm competition level as well as a China versus the rest of the world's labs level. So I'm curious, sort of before we go into the architectures themselves, how does the knowledge of what the frontier labs are doing, even though they're not publishing their results, end up kind of like leaking out into the broader ether?
Yeah. Honestly, just San Francisco parties. People just get together and talk because they like went to school together or they work together. OpenAI does layoffs. I don't know if people know that. They just did a fairly big one in January where some people left. And so like just through that natural attrition, like people leave all the time. People, whether it's by choice or not by choice. And then they talk. They do take knowledge with them, and California is a non-compete state, so you can't violate IP, but you can take with you the knowledge that you gained working at a company. So that does diffuse knowledge quite a bit between all the big labs, between Google, OpenAI, Anthropic, whatever. And so like I expect like that is informally how things diffuse. More formally, people do publish some papers. Like OpenAI has provided some detail on like DALL-E 3 and GPT-4 Vision. That was surprising because like they're not anywhere as open on the language model stuff. DeepMind continues to publish quite a lot of papers on everything that they do, except they don't publish the models, so you can't really try them out. And so like, you can go down the list in terms of like Anthropic publishes a lot of interpretability research, but nothing on Claude. So like you can just kind of go down the list and bet on the diffusion of knowledge through humans, just natural attrition. But I do think like there's a fair amount of like discussion. You can see these ideas pop up in open source where they try to, if people hear about a good idea, they try to sort of whitewash it and then, brand it as their own. Particularly some of the there's very a prominent example with Upstage AI last December, where they took an idea that had kind of been in the air, applied their own name on it, and then published their own paper, claiming that idea as their own. And there was a little bit of a hoo-ha around like, attribution and stuff. But basically, like if an idea is valuable, it'll find its way out just because everyone's going to be talking about it in that really small community. And sometimes it will be in its original form, and sometimes it'll be in like a different new form.
Is just the knowledge that this is a direction to explore like broadly enough to get you most of the way there? Or where does the kind of know-how and the experience of actually having worked on these models in the past really play into you being able to unlock the benefits of whatever architectural innovation is coming down the pipeline or seems promising within one of the major labs?
I would say a lot. And also, when we talk about some of these innovations, is like you need to actually have a model running. So if you think about mixture of experts, right? If you look at the Mistral mixture of experts model, which is 7 billion parameters heads, you need about 80 gigabytes of VRAM to run it, which is, the largest H100 there. If you're trying to do that on GPT-4, which is 220 billion heads, you need like 3.5 terabytes of VRAM, which is like 43 H100s. So right now you need people that are algorithm experts, but then you also need people that are system engineering experts. You need people that are hardware experts to actually run these clusters. So it's really the know-how, it's across a lot of things. So you might even have people leaving OpenAI that have unique ideas, but don't actually have the rest of the stack to help them put into use, because they cannot actually get some of these clusters to run at the scale. The other example that you can think of is, so Anthropic, the founders of Anthropic used to work at OpenAI. And if you look at Claude, I would say Claude is definitely on GPT 3.5 level as far as performance, but they couldn't get to GPT-4. So there's already a gap there, and they hadn't been away from OpenAI for that long before. So like these learnings is like really quick versus if you look at Mistral, the Mistral team came out of Meta, and there were some of the authors on the Llama paper. Their model is better than Llama on a parameter by parameter basis. So they had obviously some unique knowledge to themselves that they brought with them. So it's kind of on a case-to-case basis, depending on where your impact was at the previous firm.
So, this is the big question, right? Is like, say a state actor hacks the GPT-4 weights and gets to read all of OpenAI's emails for a few months. Like, is that all you need? Or is there also kind of, or to what extent is there also sort of like tacit knowledge and the architecture already running and this, that, and the other thing in order to be able to run as fast as them?
Oh yeah, for sure. A bunch of architecture that's encoded in there that's not going to be in the emails. Yeah, depends what degree of ponage you're assuming. If you're just talking about weights, weights obviously you can publish right away. Just weights alone doesn't do it. You have to have the code that matches it up, and sometimes you can reconstruct it from the weight, sometimes you cannot. But let's just assume that you can steal GPT-4 right away. Then you're going to the level of communication. Then you're going to the level of tacit knowledge and infrastructure that is running. And I do think that the level of infrastructure for training like extremely large models, like we're likely to be talking trillion parameter models this year. Those are going to be, very, very proprietary and a collection of very hard-won expertise, to do with like managing distributed GPU clusters, particularly that might be very specific to their setup, right? Like that OpenAI has with Microsoft, that Microsoft effectively built an entire data center out in Austin for OpenAI. And yeah, I mean, like I'm not sure how much of that you can steal without also stealing the infrastructure.
I think in a way you've seen some of this discussion. Well, we didn't have podcasts maybe on social media in the same way, but during the semiconductor boom, with the USSR and Zelenograd and some of that, you can obviously copy a lot of the end product, but it's hard to copy the process that take you to it. And then once you're done with the process, you very quickly fall behind again. So it's like, yeah, if you got the GPT-4 weights, again, like Shawn said, the model was trained 2 years ago. So you're already 2 years behind once you figured out how to run it, which is not even that easy, So that's really the hard part about it. And software moves so quickly, that in a way it's good because, you don't have all the machinery to construct, you don't have all of that. But at the same time, this is the first time where software has actually been really bound by hardware, probably in the last 20, 30 years. So yeah, even if you got GPT-4, you probably couldn't serve more than like 50,000 customers. I don't know, 30,000 customers. There's just like not that many GPUs available for you to buy, So that's kind of the other part. It's like, yeah, academically, you could maybe run it, but you could not compete with OpenAI because you cannot serve it at the same rate.
Yeah, I mean, it's really interesting thinking about the sort of like challenges from an industrial espionage perspective, comparing across different industries, right? Because, you've seen a fair amount of success with like, Huawei and routers back in the 90s and 2000s. But, more mixed success when it comes to stuff like jet engines and aerospace, where there's like, you can have the schematics, but there's a lot of tacit knowledge in there and like building out everything that goes into manufacturing something that's as specific as something like like an engine. So it's a really interesting contrast between, on the one hand, like, yeah, it's software, you can just download it, but also you can't just download it because you're training these new models and you have to deploy them to be able to end up having the models have any economic utility at the end of the day.
I was gonna say, Jordan, another way to think about it, just in terms of open source and not, is maybe similar, to like the semi world, where some countries and even China, in a way, we're like, yeah, maybe our play is not to be at the cutting edge of this. It's like to actually have very massive manufacturing and like NAND, or like kind of like not as cutting edge production. So I think open source is gonna go in a similar way, where open source is gonna be great at doing models in like the 7, 15, 70 billion parameters range, and they're gonna be great models. They're gonna be very good for a lot of applications. But is AGI gonna come from like a few open source people like working on a model? I find that unlikely. So I think you'll see maybe more concentration in the new year of like, okay, let's not actually worry about getting AGI here. Let's just focus on getting a great model to do code generation, to do summarization, to do all these like smaller tasks.
What is the rationale for a Mistral or a Meta to spend like, I don't know, $100 billion training something and then just like kind of put it out for free? I mean, is that something that can make sense going forward, or is sort of the what has been underpinning sort of step change increases in open source something that's like ultimately going to be cannibalized by capitalism?
I mean, Meta burns a lot more money doing VR and AR, and they don't get a lot out of it. So I think the ROI on getting Llama was probably much higher, especially in terms of like brand. I would say that kind of helped them. There's obviously the good old VC subsidized lifestyle that in the United States we first had with ride sharing and food delivery, where like everything was free. I think now the same thing is happening with AI. It's like we have a lot of money flowing into these companies to train model, do fine tunes, offer very cheap AI inference. At some point, you got to make money, right? There's not endless amount of it. But I think today, one, as you said, you need talent to do these things too, right? And to get talent, you need to be able to attract it, to know that they're going to do good work. So if you have a lot of money and you have a lot of GPUs, you can go to the best people and say, hey, why would you go work at a company that really cannot give you the infrastructure you need to do the work you need to do? Why don't you go work at Meta? Why don't you go work at Together AI? You can work at Mistral or any of these companies. So that's another angle, It's like, it's almost like, the winners keep on winning. It's like, okay, you're already ahead because you have more GPUs. Now you also get the best people. And because more people use you, you get more data. And it's kind of like a self-fulfilling prophecy in a way. So I think you'll see more of that this year because Llama 3 is going to come out at some point. I'm sure Mistral is working on something else. OpenAI should release GPT-5, I think Sam said soon, which I don't know what that means in his mind, but he said you cannot out accelerate me, so it must be in the short term. So yeah, there's a lot coming up there.
There is a little bit of co-opting by capitalism, as you put it. So Mistral only put out their 7B and 8x7B models, but their Mistral Medium model is effectively closed source, just like OpenAI's is. And in a way, you can start to see the open source models as free tier marketing for the closed source versions of those open source models. If this Mistral playbook is what's going on for some of the other companies as well, like the Perplexity ones. So there's some amount of that, which is like open source can be a recruiting tool, which it is for Meta, or it can be marketing, which it is for Mistral. And there is some incentive to continue putting things out in open source, but it'll obviously become increasingly competitive as the cost of these things go up.
Yeah. It's an interesting point you made, Alessio, about like the talent wants to work with the GPUs. One of the very dramatic things that sort of my eyes were open to at NeurIPS was just, it's one thing to see the charts and it's another of the sort of nationality breakdown. And it's another thing to be like, oh man, like everyone's speaking Mandarin here. Like that's cool. And if come 2025, 2026, like Huawei hasn't gotten its shit together and there just aren't a lot of top of the line AI accelerators for you to play with if you work at Baidu or Tencent, then the relative trade-off of staying in the US versus taking a trip back to China and joining some startup that's raised $500 million or whatever ends up becoming it ends up being like I guess another factor where the top engineers really end up wanting to spend their professional careers.
Yeah, I mean, I will say there is some draw, like Yi and Quen via Alibaba, and DeepSeek, all are, I guess, very, very well-performing, respectable Chinese labs, effectively, that have secured their GPUs and have secured their reputation as research destinations. So, like, I would consider all of them on par with like the major US ones.
Yeah. So yeah, let's talk about those labs and those models. I've played around a fair amount with them, and like you have come away like just impressed with the performance. Any sort of broader take, Shawn, on what you're seeing out of these companies?
DeepSeek is surprisingly good. Like all of the like the three that I mentioned are the I would say the leading ones. There's other attempts that are not as prominent, like Zhipu and all that. But I would say like each of them have their own claim as to like open source models that have stood the test of time, at least in this very short sort of AI cycle, that everyone else outside of China is still using. Like usually in the olden days, the sort of pitch for Chinese models would be like it does Chinese and English, and that would be like the main source of differentiation. But now they're just standing alone as really good coding models, really good general language models, really good basis for fine tuning, and I think that's great.
Yeah. What's interesting is like you've seen a similar dynamic where the established firms have kind of struggled relative to the startups, where we had Google was like sitting on their ass for a while, and the same thing with Baidu of just not quite getting to where the independent labs were.
It's interesting that
Um,
Baidu seems to be the Google of China in many ways. I know they hate the Google of China comparison, but even Baidu's AI launch was also like kind of uninspired and like not no one really like they announced Ernie 4.0. I see you have this in your notes, and like they're like, trust us, it's better than everyone else, and like no one's be able to verify that.
yeah, it's been interesting ride for them, I guess, betting the house on this only to be upstaged by like a handful of startups that's raised like $100 million. Um, I want to come back to the like what makes OpenAI so special thing. You guys alluded to like Anthropic seemingly not being able to capture the magic. What from a sort of like organizational design perspective has really allowed them to pop relative to the other labs, do you guys think?
Um, it's always hard to say from the outside because they're so secretive, you know? Like Shawn and I were at an hackathon at OpenAI maybe a year and a half ago. And you would just, they will host an event in their office. I think today you need like a, DHS and like security clearance to like get into the OpenAI office. So it's hard. It's really hard to get a glimpse today into how they work. Also Rune, who's a famous, Twitter anon, he had this tweet as like all the people at OpenAI that make eye contact started working here in the last 6 months. And so I think that also the type of people that work at the company have changed. I would say they've been early to the space, right? In relative terms. I would say OpenAI is now, I would say 5, maybe 6 years old, something like that. A lot of the labs and other kind of like new companies that start today that just want to do what they do, you kind of get in a way second grade talent because a lot of the people that were great, like Ilya and Karpathy and folks like that, that are passionate about the mission, they were already there. So going back to kind of like, the talent loop, now it's like, oh, I want to go work with Andre Karpathy. I should go work at OpenAI. I want to go work with Sam Altman. I should go work at OpenAI. So that has been really, really helpful. The other thing, they've done a lot more work trying to draw people in that are not researchers with some of their product launches. I actually don't think they're really great at product on an absolute scale compared to like product companies. I would say, the GPTs and the plugin store, they're kind of half-baked. But it inspires people that don't just want to be limited to research to go there. And then that's what then helps them capture more of like the broader mind share of like product engineers and like AI engineers, and they're more in touch with the OpenAI brand because they get to play with it. So I think that has been one thing. And for example, Claude, I don't think many people use Claude, but I use Claude API, but like I don't really go on the Claude chat. Like there's really not, it's just really a simple text box, So like it makes it also hard for exploration. So yeah, I would say that's a lot of it. I've had, one of my friends left OpenAI recently, and he said, so he was like a software engineer, and he said Sam Altman called them personally, and he was a fan of his work. I don't think in a lot of companies you have the CEO of probably like the most important AI company in the world, like call you on a Saturday as an individual contributor saying, oh, I really appreciated your work and it's sad to see you go, like that doesn't happen often. So that kind of gives you a glimpse into like the culture, which is, or if you look at like Greg Brockman on Twitter, it's like, he's just like an hardcore engineer. Like it's not somebody that is like just saying buzzword and whatnot. And that attracts that kind of people. And I think how they got to the best results with GPT-4, I don't think it's some secret scientific breakthrough. I think it's more like sound engineering and like a lot of it compounding together. So I think that's what the other labs need to catch up on. It's like they probably have similar PhD level talent, but they might not have the same type of talent to get the infrastructure and the product around it.
There have been a few comments from Sam over the years that I do keep in mind whenever thinking about the building of OpenAI. He actually had a blog post maybe about 2 months ago called "What I Wish Someone Had Told Me," which is probably the closest you'll ever get to an honest, direct reflection from Sam on how he thinks about building OpenAI. And a lot of it is like fighting bureaucracy, spending time on recruiting, focusing on outcomes and not process. And I think for me, the more interesting reflection for Sam on ChatGPT was that he realized that you cannot just be a research only company. You have to be sort of a full stack research and products company. And I think now with his venture into chips, which he has strenuously denied commenting on, he's going even more full stack than most people consider full stack. And I do think like that seems to be working quite a bit in AI, where like not being too narrow in your domain and being general in terms of like thinking about the entire stack from first principles and what you need and what needs to happen from first principles, and then hiring the people to get that going. I think it seems to be working for them really well.
Yeah, I felt a little bad for Sam. Like those CHIPS Act applications have closed. I don't think he'll be able to get in on that gravy train. But it was funny seeing him talk, being like, on the one hand, yeah, I'm gonna raise $7 trillion and like chat with Raimundo about it just to get her take. Alessio, I want to come back to one of the things you said about the sort of breakdown between having these researchers and the sort of like engineers who are more on the system sides, like doing the actual implementation. And there's like a long tradition in these sorts of labs type organizations where the type of culture that you want to create in order to make it welcoming and exciting for researchers to give up academic careers is kind of different from the ones where you're all about production. And we've heard lots of stories probably impersonally as well as reported in the news about the challenges that DeepMind has had in kind of changing modes from this like we're just like researching and like doing stuff we think is cool to like Sundar being like, come on, like I'm under the gun here, everyone wants to fire me, like let's ship some stuff already. Maybe explore a little bit more about the tension as these organizations have to kind of like walk and chew gum at the same time.
I see a lot of this as so what we do at Decibel, we invest in early stage software infrastructure. So it's usually we're working with the founders to build companies. So I've seen a lot of how the talent evolves at different stages of it. I mean, I just mentioned this with OpenAI, right? Like OpenAI is not that old. It's only like 5-6 years old. If you think about Google, you have a lot of like a talent depth in a way, you could call it, the same way you think about tech with like tech depth in code. Like talent is similar, where like when you're trying to like reorganize yourself in a new area, you have a lot of people that were there before that might not be ready for what's next. So if you think about AI 5 years ago, if you think about AlphaGo, it's like the pinnacle of like AI, right? It's kind of like a research project. You're playing Go against like a person, but there's not really like they're bringing the computers to the place and they're all sitting there running the algorithm in front of them. It's not like a product. Versus all of a sudden it's like, oh, OpenAI is like 100 million users. Like we need to build Bard and Gemini and like compete with them. That's a completely different ballpark, to be in. And some people might not want to do it. They might not be built for it. But then again, they're your most senior people because they've been there this whole time, kind of spearheading DeepMind and building their organization. So I think it takes a little bit of time to recalibrate that. And we see that in definitely a lot of our founders are people that were previously at large companies and felt like the company could not move themselves in a way that is going to be, on track with the new technology wave, and end up starting new company. I think what has maybe stopped more of that from happening today is the companies are still doing well, especially OpenAI. I mean, OpenAI is like an amazing business. I don't really see a lot of founders leaving OpenAI to start something new because I think the consensus within the company is that they are by far the best, that by far the best model, that by far the best access to capital and GPUs, and that the best people. So there's not, leaving OpenAI and saying, I'm going to start a company and like dethrone them. It's kind of crazy, So I think you see maybe more of that in vertical applications where people say, OpenAI wants to be, I use this analogy of like synchronous versus asynchronous AI. Like OpenAI is like very synchronous. It's like you go on ChatGPT and it's kind of like 101. You use their check completion API, you do one-on-one. And then there's the whole asynchronous part, which is AI agents, it's co-pilots that kind of work for you in the background, things like that. That is not really in the OpenAI DNA so far in product. So you see people leaving to start those kind of companies. But yeah, outside of that, it's kind of hard to convince founders to leave. We tried. We had some ideas that we wanted people to leave those companies and start, and it's really hard to get them out of it. But I'm curious to see how OpenAI in the next 2, 3, 4 years changes, because it will change by nature of the work that they're doing. And maybe more OpenAI founders will pop up.
So part of the reason you keep you try to keep your brilliant PhDs happy is to be the first to find and exploit architectural advancements. Shawn, you teased this earlier. What are some of the different ways of approaching these models that you're particularly excited about, and what are the kind of knock-on effects for demand for different types of compute or data that they could potentially unlock?
Oh, that's a really interesting question. So I happen to be working on a summary post about this, which is why it's very top of mind. This is a non-exhaustive list, but I will just mention the top things which I expect to see progress on this year. So the very top is, unfortunately, I have to mention Q star, which is something that is kind of a meme online because it was obliquely referenced by Mira Murati in an internal all hands. And then the YouTube content creator industrial complex blew it up to all sorts of proportions. But I do believe that search is going to be a big frontier of research that effectively none of the open source people are pursuing, and basically only OpenAI and DeepMind are pursuing it. And so what search means is, intuitively for your audience, is that models should take more time to think about harder problems than easy problems, right? So right now, because the way that language models work is they just predict token by token by token, it takes exactly the same amount of time to tell you the answer of what is 1 + 1 as it does, solve the Riemann hypothesis. And ideally, you should be able to give your model a budget of how long it has to think. If you have a longer time to think, you can do more chain of thought. You can do more search and research, and you can do more code prototyping and testing of that code. You can do all sorts of stuff and self introspection before arriving at an answer. So this comes to the question of okay, instead of optimizing models to respond to you as quickly as possible, what if you just gave them a day, a year, 10 years? What can they come up with? And the classic finding that I wrote about this on the Latent Space blog is that for every unit of time that you give it to think, in terms of extra time to infer, that's roughly equivalent to 10,000 units of that in pre-training. So that is really interesting in terms of just the flexibility of models, the size of models that you can deploy, and the general capability towards AGI. And so whatever Q-star is, whatever people start landing on as the sort of the real-time search component of LLMs, we don't know what it looks like today because no one actually has a working prototype yet. But if they manage to get it working, which is highly likely given that they've hired everyone prominent in that field, then that will be GPT-5.
Great. So let's sort of, as we go through these, let's also talk about them from a sort of compute greediness and ultimately compute greediness, a data greediness, and to what just how hard would it be to fast follow from a Chinese lab perspective context. So on those three components, what are we thinking about when it comes to fancier search?
Yeah, so real-time search. By the way, search, I'm using search in the computer scientist terminology, not the consumer internet, Google.com search. Search is more real-time search in terms of I have 10 paths. and each of those 10 branch into 10 more paths. So for me to search all the 100 branches of all these paths, that is a search algorithm in terms of this sort of machine learning and AI aspect. So yeah, in terms of data greediness, not very greedy, because all you need is reasoning capability, but you do need planning capability, and planning data sets are very sparse and few and far between. I have seen quite a few advancements, particularly in Europe, where people have improved the planning resources. And I think synthetic data is actually coming in very strongly here. I refer people to the alpha geometry paper from DeepMind that was published like a month ago, where they effectively had like 100-step planning stages for doing mathematical proofs at the Olympiad level. And that's really solid planning. I mean, that's something that, is you have to be in like the top percentile in sort of human capability to do. So I think data wise, you just need like really good planning data and not a ton else additional from what we have here. Compute wise, it's going to be a monster in terms of compute consumption, because what does it mean to run an LLM for like a year? And that's going to cost you a few tens and hundreds of thousands of dollars. And then finally, in terms of fast following, if the details are secret, it's going to take a while. The same deal as what GPT-4 is now versus all the other LLMs. It's been 2 years and no one's really successfully copied it. So I think if the details are obvious and publicized, then yes, but in the short term, probably they will not be fast followed. In the fullness of time, like, give it on. If you zoom out in the grand scheme of humanity, you're really trying to evaluate things in terms of fast follow, in terms of like a 1 to 2 year time frame, when really like actually a 10 to 20 year time frame is also still pretty fast. So like I would just say like maybe step back if you're more of the sort of philosophical bent, and if you're more of like a competitive bent, then maybe you have to zoom in a little bit closer. But that'll be my quick take on just the real time search element.
Yeah, I mean, you're jumping ahead of my questions, because I do think like if you're thinking about like long term, okay, to what extent will AI be able to unlock productivity growth in this economy over a 10 to 20 year horizon? Like, it doesn't really matter if it takes like 1 or 3 or 5 years to figure out just how Q-star works. But the sort of big question, I guess, is like, if you actually need foreign GPUs, regardless of how nice your model is, in order to be able to like have the smart one that can actually sort of increase productivity in your factory or your services company or what have you, then you start to get that kind of like differential impact of what AI can do for your economy over time, as opposed to just like having the time series be like lagged by a few years while engineers across the Pacific just figure out what it is that you came up with from a algorithmic innovation perspective.
Yeah, I got you. I'll leave it to Alessio to mention that. But like, I think one thing that where we're a little bit more sanguine about this sort of foreign GPU ban thing is that I don't think compute is like at the limit that specialized. If you just need a ton more compute, I think there's a Chinese phrase which I don't know how often Chinese is spoken in China Talk podcast, but 滥竽充数. 滥竽充数. So like using like a lot of poorer GPUs can make up for like really like a fewer really good GPUs. Like, so quantity can make up for quality in some respects. And we are talking to like Together AI, we're talking to MLC, we're talking to Modular. There's any amount of engineering focused on running compute and even training workloads on heterogeneous compute, like non-NVIDIA compute. I don't know if Alessio would agree with that, because we haven't actually discussed this.
Yeah, I think there are a lot of things there. So if you think about GPU alternatives and how sometimes the hardware development has been separated by the software development. You had like Cerebras come out with their own chips, and they were like, oh, let's just put a massive amount of SRAM on chip. And they put like, I think like 40 gigabytes is like the max. They were like, a model is probably never going to be bigger than 40 gigabytes. So you can always fit it on it. But then now the largest models are like, 3.5 terabytes of VRAM you would need to run them. So all of a sudden, you've done all this work trying to improve the hardware, and like it's kind of been a waste because the software was going a different way. And I think like, especially with a China lens, if you think about the GPU ban, the big question is like, how do we try and make work with what we get access to, and like Shawn said, maybe just like, it's going to be less efficient, but like you do it at a larger scale. Or do you take the gamble of saying, oh, we're going to build our own acceleration platform that might be different than what NVIDIA is building, and then hope that the best research in the world is like going in the same direction? I think the US doesn't really have that because NVIDIA works closely with OpenAI. Like, Microsoft and OpenAI work closely together to build the data centers once you have the GPUs. So there's more cohesion between hardware and software. But I think once you get cut out of the hardware pipeline, all of a sudden you have to decide, okay, are we just, again, being fast followers and using the same architecture? Are we going to try and build a different architecture maybe for our own needs? It's really hard. That's above my pay grade, but that's kind of how I would think about it. And maybe, I know there was a lot of discussion about the Huawei, like 7 nanometers, like work that they've done recently. So obviously there's a lot of latent manufacturing capability, in China. But yeah, I'll find out on your newsletter. You're definitely not gonna find out about that on Latent Space. It's gonna be on China Week, China Talk.
Well, no, it's interesting you frame it in that way, Alessio, because earlier in this conversation, you were like, look, these open source GPU cores, they're fucking around, but like at the end of the day, we're not going to count on them for big innovations because they're just constrained by the amount of capital that they have. But like, look, if you have like an entire nation of some of the best engineers in the world who are the ones exploring these different sort of more compact models or what have you, it's the range of outcomes I think is a lot wider than just like people who aren't good enough to get jobs or are just too weird to get jobs at Google and at DeepMind or OpenAI, kind of messing around with some money from a Series A or what have you. And I guess we'll have to see, but maybe this is a good transition back to Shawn and his model innovation tier list. What do we have after Q-Star?
Yeah. I'll just quickly mention that there's always let's just diplomatically call it the Taiwan option, and then also I think at the limit for Chinese AI, like you can leave things to private industry for so long, but at the end of the day, the government has to like want this for it to happen, and I don't feel like they want it enough. So like I'll put that there. Like this is not going to happen at a massive scale in a way that China needs it to, unless the Chinese government wants it. And so I'll leave that there.
And sorry, and by this you mean like
the frontier AI movement? Yeah,
gotcha. So what's your
leading labs?
Yeah, and what's your sense of why is your take that the appetite for this particular push isn't quite extant yet?
I think LLMs are fundamentally a little bit heretical. The fact that you can generate your own truth. And the Chinese government may not be happy with that.
Gotcha.
So yeah, I mean, this might get into more political discussions than we can afford. And I'm definitely not an expert, but
we could do this on this is not your show. We can do it on my show.
Yeah, exactly. Okay.
Yeah, no, I mean it's interesting because on the one hand, like AI has, with all of with semiconductors and EV and solar, like been in like every Chinese government tech document since 2015. And I think the sort of the AI pre GPT-3 was very much something that the Chinese government was comfortable with and excited about, where you're talking about like applications in robotics and computer vision and automated driving and all of that stuff. I think is like very much in line with what today's CCP is excited to prioritize. But you're right in a sense, Shawn, like there isn't a lot threatening about companies like Hikvision and Hisense from a Beijing oriented perspective. But there's just a lot of weirdness and a lot of uncertainty that a GPT-5 or a GPT-6 level model could potentially unlock. And on the one hand, China, like every developing country, or every country in the world, is looking for new sources of growth. But this is one that I think is like just a lot weirder than the more traditional manufacturing, which has been the sort of thing that the modern CCP has been really excited to put their weight behind. So LLMs and generative AI, it's not as like evil as like platform tech companies that have gotten this like enormous beating in the tech lash over the past 5 years with Didi and Pinduoduo, and even ByteDance, like just like having to like deal with a lot of crap because they're not doing enough to like promote national rejuvenation or what have you. But you saw a little bit of it right as ChatGPT launched, of some senior politicians saying like, we need a Chinese competitor or what have you. But there hasn't really been nearly as much focus on that, maybe just because there's enough else going on with the economy that it's kind of hard to focus on this in particular, or maybe they're sort of stressed out about the GPU ban, and there's like enough sort of chip stuff to get on people's mind. But it has been striking to me how, while the rest of the world is, and a lot of like Chinese domestic media is still very focused on, what's coming out of DeepMind and OpenAI and how important this is. And like, ChatGPT tutorials like going viral on Bilibili or whatever. But the sort of government level support that you've seen for the semiconductor industry over the past 10 years with, tens, hundreds of billions of dollars being poured in this way and that, like, has not really materialized when it comes to these AI labs that are going to be the ones trying to do the frontier pushing or fast following from a model generation and deployment perspective. Anyways, those are my takes. Shawn, back to you.
Yes.
What's some crazy model shit we should be excited
Okay.
about?
Yeah. So two more I'll mention. One is
take your time. No
one is mixture of experts, and I really love highlighting this one because it's something where the Chinese models actually took a step ahead of all the Western models. And so I love this because that means that China actually has innovation that is spreading the other way. And that's really awesome to see. And you also have and innovations in like the embedding models that we can talk about. But the mixture of experts are a really fundamental innovation shift. Like inference shift. You asked me about the data efficiency versus the compute efficiency versus the fast follow. So maybe I'll quickly mention what a mixture of experts is. So instead of one dense model, which is it's likely to be the kind of model that GPT-3 was, GT4 and above, as well as DeepSeek MOE and Mistral from the Mistral folks, are all mixtures of expert models where you combine something like 8 to 32 or 64 experts in answering a model, in answering a specific question that comes in. So you send in a question, and instead of it querying one model, it actually has a routing layer that smartly routes it to a model that is best suited to answer it, except that it doesn't work the same way that it would for a human group of experts. So a typical collection of humans, you would have them specialize in a particular domain. You're the finance person, you're the medicine person, you're the law person. The sort of machine learning mixture of experts don't work like that because they never work like humans learn. And they tend to specialize in very unique differences in like the tokens that are being predicted, and the mixtures are routed based on a token level. Anyway, so I'll just like leave that there as breadcrumbs in case people want to follow up. But the long and short of it is that in terms of data training wise, you're going to just try to consume as much data as possible, but it is surprisingly efficient for the same amount of parameters in total that is being trained. So I would say like it's like mediumly data efficient, but you're still gonna just throw as much data as you can at it. Just to give people an idea of boundaries. The top models are being trained between 1 trillion to 2.5 trillion tokens right now. And there's a case to go up to 30 trillion if you really want to broaden your scope, but no one wants to really take that risk because the quality of the data goes down as you increase your net. In terms of compute efficiency, this is the most interesting one because it's a sparse model. You actually have less active parameters because even though let's say you have 8 mixtures of 8 experts in your MOE model, only let's say 2 to 3 of them are active at any one given time. Therefore, you're actually just doing less matrix multiplications all around. Therefore, you're actually using less compute at the time. And the nuance to that is that you still have to have all the model weights loaded in memory. So you still need a lot of RAM in your GPUs. In potentially, like one GPU per expert, depending on the size of your experts, and all the related networking that requires to get that going. And then finally, the fast follow. This is the fastest follow there is. Like you can slap an MOE on top of any pre-trained model out there and have the paper out in like 5 days, which is exactly what happened to MOE Mamba with the Mamba paper that came out from Together AI. So all that is sort of my quick answer, and then I would single out in particular DeepSeek, which is related to a link to a Chinese hedge fund. DeepSeek AI as a leader in MOE models because they actually popularized this idea that you should have much smaller experts than people have been using. So typically, like Mixtral used like a 7B expert model, like 7 billion parameter expert model. They shrink it down to a lot smaller, to like 1 to 2B, and also innovated in this concept that they should have a shared expert, like an expert that is active at all times. And DeepSeek MOE is, I would say, currently the leading sort of MOE model architecture out there. So that's interesting. That's a nice win for the Chinese model labs. I don't know. Like, okay, maybe I spent all this time talking about architecture and like model requirements, but like, I will say like basically it's a free like 10 percentage point improvement in all your evals if you just make like a mixture of experts thing on top of a regular pre-trained model. So in terms of like AI progress, it's like a pretty cheap win. I classify it as more incremental because like everyone knows how to do it now, and like it's not that it's not that rocket sciencey, but it's notable because like it seems like a pure win on top of any of the pre-trained models. So it's notable for that reason.
Awesome. Why don't you pick one more? Let's do one more.
Yeah, the third one is the weirdest one. This one is let's just call it like model merging. Model grafting it's also been called. This one I've seen less out of the Chinese models, but it's very, very prevalent in the open source world. And this is the practice of instead of having a routing layer for mixing a bunch of experts, you literally like basically average the weights of equivalent size models. So literally like, if one of them has a weight of 0.5 and the other one has a weight of minus 0.5, the simple average would be like 0, because you're like the midpoint between them. And so on and so forth. What I gave you is a very simple concept of what an average weight is, but literally it's like that's what people are doing and finding really interesting results. So people are combining like, let's say 4 different 7 billion parameter models into one 7 billion parameter model, and just by averaging their weights and finding that they're the results of combining all these models are better sometimes than all the constituent models. They can often preserve the domain capabilities of some of the models that have been absorbed. And then sometimes there's like different ways of combining. So like I just told you about like the simple linear interpolation models. But like there are other ways of merging where you have sort of unequal merges that that create like really, really monster models. So like some people have created like, 150 billion parameter models from like two like 60 billion parameter models and stuff like that. All of which is like kind of hacky and weird, and like it's surprising that it works, and people don't really understand like why it works, apart from the fact that it's a form of regularization that seems to generalize really well. So it basically helps you to avoid overfitting to your own data because you're merging a bunch of models together. And it's also made me notable in the fact that like it's mostly done by like independent open source people, and later adopted by people at DeepMind. We don't have any evidence that OpenAI has adopted it because they haven't published anything, but DeepMind has, and DeepMind has come out and said, yeah, like we like this model merging phenomenon, and we're starting to train models that way too. And so that's an interesting and unusual or rare situation when the open source innovation is actually trickling back into the closed source labs, when it's usually the other way around.
And let's do our 3 cuts.
Oh my god, yeah. So data nothing, compute nothing, fast follow very fast.
Awesome.
You don't need a GPU to merge models because you're literally adding weights. It cannot be dumber. It's really surprising. You just need GPUs to run inference so you can do evals, so you can see how good the merges are. But beyond that, that's about it.
And what's our sort of percentage boost for this one? And then I don't know. Why don't you?
Oh my god, yeah. So data nothing, compute nothing, fast follow very fast.
Awesome.
Like you don't need a GPU to merge models because you're literally adding weights. It cannot be dumber. It's really surprising. You just need GPUs to run inference so you can do evals, so you can see how good the merges are. But beyond that, that's about it. You don't need extra data. You just take the existing pre-trained models.
And what's our sort of percentage boost for this one? And then
pretty good.
I don't know. Why don't you?
Yeah.
Okay.
Percentage boost. It's smaller than a mixture of expert boost. Like single digit percentages right now.
Yeah.
But still, like that's enough. When you combine a bunch of top models together, you get an even more top model. And that like a lot of the top models on the open source leaderboards are now merges, which is very strange and very weird. And it's interesting to think about that, contrasting that versus the mixture of experts thing, which is much more of a traditional machine learning approach where you learn a routing layer towards different experts. You can kind of get that. Whereas this whole thing about merging models blindly or like with some arbitrary strategy, there's a few strategies, by the way. If people are interested, you can Google merge kit and you can see all the strategies there. But yeah, like this is very cutting edge, very uncertain, but it seems that it's being validated at the big labs, that DeepMind is adopting it, and presumably all the others are as well. That it's working.
Awesome. Let's go from the sort of frontier model discussion a little more towards AI engineering. What is this field? Why is it so interesting? And what implications does it have for the sort of trajectory of this technology diffusing out into the broader economy?
I was mostly inspired by the conversations that we're having as part of Latent Space, that people were coming in and saying like, okay, like, I'm a believer in AI and I want to, make my career in it. What should I do? And I distinctly remember this conversation I had with someone at an event that we hosted, where she was like, I can do, I love AI. Like I'm spending all my time on it, but I cannot code. And I realized like there's just a fundamental difference between people who can code and utilize AI and people who are just downstream of AI products. There is an enormous amount of power that is capable of being wielded by people who can code. And I'm not just talking about prompt engineering. Like when you can construct prompts programmatically and do retrieval augmented generation, you're able to create so much more powerful systems than the people who have to use the consumer grade AI applications out there. So that's like one element of, in terms of like just the sheer amount of disparate power, I kind of wanted to draw attention to that, like that. It is not AI. It is not prompt engineer. It is AI engineer. And it is not AI enthusiast. It is AI engineer, like person who writes code, person who works on production systems. So that's one element of that. The second element I realize is that the rise of the closed API labs and the rise and the success of foundation models mean that instead of a paradigm where each company used to have to build its own ML team in-house, you can actually kind of buy it off the shelf or rent it off the shelf from the large model labs or the open source hosting services. What doesn't matter, and then take it from there to build something interesting as an AI engineer. Therefore, there's a whole generation of ML researchers, research scientists, ML engineers, data scientists that you used to have to hire to build AI-enabled applications that you don't really need to start. That you can just take someone who's a regular engineer who is familiar with all the AI tooling and get going just from there. And that's a huge simplification. That's a huge cost saving. That's a huge increase in the ability to ship quickly. And I wanted to call that out as a trend, so I called it the AI engineer.
I think the rise of the AI engineer, most interesting piece is all of a sudden companies that couldn't attract talent can have talent that is enabled by other people's work. So if you think about, ML 5 years ago, I talked to a lot of companies that were trying to sell like ML ops tools. It's like experiment, observability, all these things. But most companies are like, ML people don't want to come work here. Like the work is not that interesting, So you kind of had a whole lot of companies that could actually use AI for a lot of use cases and like increasing productivity, getting better product, better gross margins, but they just could not get the people to go work there to apply it to their problem and problem space. Versus now you have the best people clustering at OpenAI, Anthropic, DeepMind, whatever. Then they open the models, and now you have the person working on software for lawyers, like leveraging AI to make software for lawyers. That the best, Andrew Karpathy would not start a company to sell software to lawyers, I'm sure. But now, you have AI engineers that are, like Shawn said, they're not PhDs, but they're people that are interested in building great product and great software. And they work at companies that have a very specific use case for this technology. And all of a sudden, you can do that. So that has been, from my vantage point, the most interesting thing. We have a very big community of enterprise early adopters. These are Fortune 500 companies building all sort of stuff. A lot of them are not software companies at all, but now they can use ChatGPT, they can use the GPT APIs to build a lot more productivity into their organization, where before you could have never built like a natural language team that would have been capable of building this stuff. So that's super exciting. That's obviously scary for startups in a way, because all of a sudden, even the large companies get all of this for free. And now you have to differentiate on different angles. But I think it's great at the end of the day for the end consumer. What we still haven't figured out is, does the value accrue to the company or does it just accrue to the consumer? That's something that Charlie Munger always makes this example with textile machinery. Like the more efficient the textile process has gotten, the more prices have gone down, but the companies have not made a single cent more, basically, off of that. I'm curious to see if in AI it's going to be the same, where everything is going to be, super easy and cheap for consumers, but like the enterprises actually don't capture a lot of that. It's just passed through, but it's still too early to tell.
Gotcha. Any closing thoughts, Shawn? Maybe going out, building off of this to our sort of 10, 20-year horizon of what all this stuff can enable. Want to, take what we talked about today and add that lens to it?
10, 20 years, everything will be, all this AI is like here, but it's not evenly distributed. We'll have figured out how to evenly distribute it. I think the biggest change that isn't really a thing right now, but will be a thing, is on-device AI, particularly on your phones, and let's say within your own personal machines. Being able to plug that into something that's yours, that's private, that's dare I say, small, that only serves intelligent needs for your purposes. I think that is going to happen. It will be hard to monetize because if effectively you have to be Apple or Samsung or whatever, or one of the hardware manufacturers. But I think like that is something that everybody wants. Nobody really wants to call out to like an OpenAI and like send all your personal private data there. Everyone's only doing it just because you have like they currently have the top models. But the moment that we have reached some kind of generally intelligent future where like if all the open source models are like good enough and like we can actually put them towards use for all our personal needs, then there's absolutely no way but local and private models for your personal needs. And I think and that's going to apply to businesses as well, right? Like the B2B needs are just an amplification of personal needs.
Yeah. And I think sort of that vision of the future is one that a lot of maybe my audience in Washington hasn't quite internalized, is like, from everything we've talked about and everything I've learned from you guys over the course of listening to your show, it seems like over a long enough time horizon, it's like there's a pretty decent chance that you're not going to end up in a world in which these secrets, these can be kept like secrets. The sort of what it takes to build a really cutting edge model. And even if, there is some sort of like fast following that goes along, we're as likely to see this as a sort of, electricity type innovation as like a nuclear bomb that only a few countries have and like the rest can't access. And trying to sort of conceptualize what the broader, economic and geopolitical implications of artificial intelligence are, if like everyone can kind of like have the basic ingredients to deploy this stuff, as opposed to it right now being this very sort of securitized, like, let's just like keep these secrets and like, put as many, locks and keys around OpenAI as possible and hope that they, keep chugging along, is a really important frame to think about this if you're looking at it from, something beyond, 3 to 5 years.
And I think in the short term, I think it was March 2023, we're in the Future of Life Institute did like the Stop All AI Development for 6 months letter. It's like now 12 months have passed. I mean, like, are we that much further along? It just feels like sometimes when it's a new technology, people that were not a part of the creation of it feel like it's all of a sudden it's here, but like it will take 10, 20 years is like, I think, a better time frame to like really make these predictions and like plan accordingly versus like, oh, any moment now it could happen, but it doesn't really work that way, so we'll see. I mean, when we started the podcast, we were actually, we wanted to only do AI engineering and we wanted to do it weekly. And we're like, maybe we'll run out of things to talk about like soon. And I think we've now done, 55 episodes, something like that. We have a lot more scheduled and we have a lot more things we haven't even covered, so there's just like a ton of work happening. And when you have so much entropy, in like a system, it's hard to predict the outcome, but I think the entropy is good. Without the entropy, you're just kind of like staying where you were before. And that's never how technology has helped humanity. So
maybe one more question for you guys. There's been some talk in Washington about this idea of algorithmic export controls. Thoughts, questions, comments on that as like a feasible way to think about controlling the trajectory of this technology?
It's really hard. I think we already struggle so much in open source software with figuring out how to actually enforce stuff like the GPL license, which theoretically means if you use any code under GPL license, you have to open source everything you do. Obviously, when you read GPL code, you're gonna learn the patterns and you're gonna learn how things are built, and then you're gonna re-implement it. And it's like, well, it's not really that, but I learned it from it. So I think like it will be hard. You would need to force everybody working on this to not talk about it publicly. And I think you cannot really do that outside of like a government setting, you know? Like, I don't think there's been in the history of technology, like a technology company that we didn't end up figuring out how they were doing a certain thing, you know? And then we talked at length about how even if you had the GPT-4 weights, how hard it would be to actually do it. But I think it's hard to enforce, algorithmic exports in a way that doesn't hurt you internally. Again, I'm a technologist and an engineer. I'm not a policy expert, you know, but for me, it's kind of like once you make it hard for people to build and to explore, you're maybe hurting yourself more than you're hurting the other party, you know?
Yeah. So I think the open source movement is probably going to be more powerful. This is like kind of like banning torrents, you know, like it just can't work unless you want to like change the fundamental communication structure of the internet. So like maybe a surprising or non-consensus take, but like I think the rules, or like the Biden White House administration's rules on like requiring notification for large training runs for like I think 10E26 is like the barrier. So let's say GPT-5 is right now 10E25 in terms of like the number of flops that it takes to train GPT-4 and 5. So something that is like truly next level. It is, you know, by executive order required to be, you're supposed to notify the powers that be. And I think that's probably a good, you know, rough benchmark. Like, yes, you can quibble a lot with like the efficiency of flops, and people are saving a lot of efficiency of flops by using the strategies that we talked about, you know, like moving from training to inference using real-time search and QStar. The thing you just legislated as having a limit now no longer applies, right? Like, you know, like so it is a very holy, you know, it's full of holes, like this concept. But let's just say, like, yes, pre-training, having a large pre-train stage is still going to matter, and more powerful AI is going to come with more scale. Then like that actually is a pretty good restriction or limitation, and something where if you're worried about safety or national defense, you should just keep watch on that and keep tabs on the distribution of GPUs, just like you would distribution of nuclear material. I have one benchmark or metric that I would like to leave your audience with, actually, that I worked out a while ago, and it's pretty fun to think about for like the 10-year horizon, right? So a rough rule of thumb is that compute roughly 100x's, like goes up by 2 orders of magnitude, every GPT version. So GPT-3 took about a person year of compute, according to George Hotz. And so that was about 1,000 A100s for 34 days. GPT-4 was 25,000 A100s for 90 days, and that's about 96 person years of compute, or in other words, 100 person years of compute. So GPT-4 is 100 times the amount of compute that GPT-3 was. And you can kind of extrapolate that, right? So if you can equate that to like GPT-3 is 1 year of compute, GPT-4 is one lifetime of compute, like one person's lifetime. GPT-5 is 100 lifetimes. GPT-6 is 10,000. ... If you get to GPT-9 in the same scale, if this is like the new Moore's law of scaling, that's 10 billion lifetimes for GPT-9, and GPT-10 is 1 trillion lifetimes. So roughly GPT 9.5. So GPT-9 is every human that's alive today. That's the order of magnitude that of intelligence that it will command. And GPT 9.5 will be every human that has ever lived, which is roughly 100 billion humans. And that, it puts things in perspective. We don't have that anywhere near that amount of compute today, and I don't know if we'll ever get there. But if you take scaling seriously, and if you take the trends that we have had up to date seriously, this is where we end up in 10 years.
And sorry, this is what we end up with 10 years is how it is how hungry they are, or how it's both how hungry they are and how smart they are.
Yeah, how smart they are. How much evolution will have happened to these things in the span of 10 years that it took us maybe 100,000 years to evolve.
Gotcha. Well, maybe we will only have to wait for GPT-7 in order for it to create a China Talk custom outro music for all of you guys. Shawn, Alessio, this was such a pleasure. Thank you so much for teaching me some stuff, and would love to have you back sometime soon.
Thank you, Jordan. This was fun.